Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about social media, communication, radicalization, and how all those elements influence the emerging sphere or emerging field of radicalization, extremism, and terrorism in the world, but mainly in the United States. My guest today, an expert in the field, is Gordon L. Young. Hello, Gordon.
Hello, Martin. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Gordon L. Young is a professor of speech communication and dean of faculty at Kingsborough Community College, City University of New York. His research focuses on intercultural communication and postcolonialism, within popular culture and critical perspectives on education, culture, identity, gender, class, and sexuality. I invited Gordon due to his great knowledge about social media in the United States, about how the speech works, how the elements of the speech influence the society, and especially radicalization and extremism, which are emerging in the United States. So we divided this interview into 3 sections, and we'll start with the first one, which is about recruitment, radicalization, and propaganda. So let's jump in. And the first question, Gordon, I'm interested in the social media in the recruitment process, what they use, what radicals, what extremists or terrorists they use in social media to recruit people. And we know that social media are changing because there is a new technology, new algorithms. So how is this influencing all that process?
Thank you for having me, Martin. So first to start, one important thing to point out is that for terror and extremist organizations online, they have what are called, some have what are called media mujahideen or jihadi group supporters who share propaganda on social media. And this can really blur the line between content producer and audience because it isn't necessarily a leader sharing it, it's being shared at the grassroots level. And I want to say at this point, very carefully, I want to make a caveat at this point that even though I just mentioned mujahideen and jihad, which are Middle East and North African identified language, I want to be careful to say that terror and extremism comes from everywhere, not just the Middle East and North African region. So we don't want to generalize. So for instance, a terror promoter, Mr. and Mrs. X, we could call them, might not be influential within Joe Smith's personal friendship network, but getting Jane or Joe Smith to share the video on their network is going to change the way it's seen, and it's going to contribute to the meaning of that video. So its potential for persuasion among that group is going to grow. And when I talk about this, I talk about how one time I shared, for instance, in my own social media platform, I shared a parody news article. I have lots of Australian friends, and I shared a news article to make them laugh about how Australians have all these gripes with Canadians. It was a parody news site that was online with The Onion, the United States parody news site. And my Australian friends got a great laugh out of it. But some of my friends who know me only through serious postings on social media started questioning, are there real cultural divides here, right? So, it added to the meaning of the text, right? Journalists have learned this lesson because, journalists have long learned to post disclaimers on their sites because, as they repost and retweet content for stories they've not checked, right? They've found that audiences were accepting these wholeheartedly, accepting the content because it was posted by a journalist. And the reputation of that journalist was influencing the audience. Aristotle might call it ethos, right? The ethos, the reputation of the speaker influences how the content's received. And so they've learned to start, disclaiming, I've not read, I've not fact-checked this article. But as we see the reposting and retweeting of content, the lines between content producer and content consumer are really blurring, right? Anytime, something's retweeted, you could argue that the consumer is participating in the production of that in some way. Similarly, the feedback, the language that is posted in comments, that's also helping to construct the meaning and sort of in some ways, shape the reliability of the information in some people's minds. So another way that terror and extremist organizations are adapting is that closing one platform, one extremist site, doesn't stop the terrorist network, right? The network's going to reconfigure itself, right? Some people call it, two researchers, Fisher, Sergio, called it a swarmcast, right? Like how swarms of bees and birds, if one of their flock falls out, they just reconfigure themselves in their formations mid-flight. And we see this with the way terrorist organizations organized. So if you were to shoot one bird, heaven forbid, from the flock would reconfigure itself, right? We also see things like Twitter storming and tweet storming, where groups will like or share hashtag content because it causes it to become a global trend, right? So versus the traditional broadcast where there's a message coming from one place, you have messages coming from all over the world, right? Some also talk about something called net war, which is when you have small individual actors all over the world network together, right? And they're waging low-level crime or terror in their individual areas, right? As a way for terrorists to act in a decentralized way. So they're really moving away from centralization, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. But I have to say at this point too, that some of these techniques are also used in very pro-social ways for positive movements. For instance, we look at the events of the Arab Spring, right? Or the Me Too movement. You could forge an argument too that these are net war or swarm casting, right? Where you have a bunch of individual actors with valid grievances that want to get those out on a global stage, and they use this swarm casting, Twitter storming, or net war to sort of get that across. But you also see it used by figures historically like Osama bin Laden, who had a network of terrorist cells, right? Other things we see are things called botnets, right? When you have a terror group infect a group of computers with malicious software, so it sends out their messaging usually without the users knowing. It's happened to me. I know it's happened to many of my colleagues. Homeland Security in the US has been looking at this in terms of elections from 2016 on, and how this kind of bot network may have influenced the outcomes of elections. You also see things like click farming or like farming, where low-paid individuals are used to click or like en masse just some online content, like what has been called China's 50-cent army, where it's actually in a book by a man named Rongbing Han. He writes this book called Contesting Cyberspace in China, and he talks about this massive 50-cent army where the Chinese government actually pays individuals to click or like pro-government or pro-regime content, because they know they'll never stop the internet at large, but they can also maybe think they can also sway it within their own neighborhoods. A couple other things, hashtag hijacking. When you take a positive hashtag that's pro-social, and a terror group might attach terror content to that to reach a large mass group, because a positive hashtag is going to reach a large group. Or a repost storm, when you have something pulled down and then a network of users just engages in mass reposting of it. It could be a botnet, right? So in the communication that I've studied, I started out cutting my teeth on interpersonal, two-person communication, and that type of communication. We always had this concept of permanence, this idea that if you put a message out into the world, to another person, it never goes away. You can never reverse it. It's permanent, it's irreversible. But even more so with social media, right? In the case of two-person relationships, you or the other person, remember, but we no longer have the ability to pull back messages. We can no longer be guaranteed that a message has ever been erased. And that's a scary thing in some ways. If you look at the Christchurch mosque attacks in 2019, where, over 50 people were shot and killed at two mosques in New Zealand, and, over 30 people were injured. My numbers might be a little off, but, it's been impossible to remove content like that, even though it is disturbing content filmed by the shooter. It's been impossible to remove that from online, no matter, despite very diligent attempts by social media companies and other agencies. So it's like a game of whack-a-mole. We have this carnival game, and probably we have it all over the world, where you try to hit a mole as it pops up from a hole at a carnival. And that's kind of like what terror groups are doing online. You hit one mole and another one pops up somewhere else.
Gordon, may I ask you, you are expert on speech and all those signs behind, as I say. What is the quality of messages posted by those groups? I mean, do we have mostly simple sentences with clear messages, or we have sort of more sophisticated, let's say even metaphorical messages? What's your opinion about that?
Mm-hmm. No, it can be anything from the mundane to the complex, right? One of the things that we see is that terror organizations are meeting potential recruits where they live, right? So, amongst young men all over the world, video gaming, online gaming, mass gaming is a big phenomenon, right? So you see terror groups producing very high quality videos, very high quality, very high quality productions, right? That actually mimic some high fidelity, high resolution game perspectives. Where, for instance, like a game like Call of Duty, where I haven't played it personally, but I know I've seen simulations of it where, the actual player is playing from a soldier point of view, or a shooter or a killer point of view, and they're actually moving through a space in real time and trying to, execute. You see that videos produced by terrorist organizations are emulating these types of productions, or they have, very sort of sophisticated online publications that are hyperlinked, and sort of the content actually, is not just text content, but it actually is multimedia. It's, Internet 2.0, right down to the very grassroots sort of, work that's done by individual actors who maybe don't have all the tools. So it's a range. It's a range.
Can you analyze, or can you tell us a little bit about the effectiveness of counter-narratives on social media in combating terrorism, extremism, radicalization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a question that a lot of different government organizations, social media organizations have looked at. I know there's a UN Office of Counterterrorism, and they've sought to really look at how someone becomes radicalized, right? And what's the trajectory that someone goes on, and how do we break that down? How do we analyze that? With one goal of that being, the construction of counter narratives. With that said, we are talking about counter narratives, but another goal I'll sort of put in the background is, another goal is, getting individuals to break away and disengage. We want to combat the propaganda, but we also want to sort of splinter the groups as well, right? We want to sort of reintegrate individuals that are on the fringe, that are most susceptible to counter narratives, and bring them back into pro-social society, right? So the UN talks about a trajectory being like attraction. How the process works: attraction, engagement, participation, and then you see some, very quickly become disengaged, but there's no outlet. And then, organizations suggest, governmental organizations suggest, providing a means for reintegration, right? U.S. scholars, will argue, a lot of U.S. scholars that I've read will argue that, counter propaganda, counter narrative in its many forms has been unsuccessful. European organizations like the EU Parliament, in their studies of counter narratives, they suggest that, they're a little more cautious in their approach, and they suggest, which is probably a better way to look at it, that we just lack data. We can't just say that the efforts have been unsuccessful, but we just haven't significantly studied it enough. We need to look at it more in depth and figure out, are these efforts successful? As of right now, I couldn't call it off the top of my head, but I haven't seen many studies that have really in depth jumped into, are these counter efforts successful, like long-term in-depth studies. I think there are some, but I think the critique of the EU Parliament is, their study group is correct. I think there is more study needed. I don't think we should just reject it out of hand and say it hasn't been effective until we actually see proof that it hasn't. But the narratives, the counter narratives that do get produced, the ones that do try to counter terrorist activity, are ones that attempt to show reality, right? Because violent extremist organizations, terror organizations, really want to market themselves through their glossy media content, right? Videos that show sophisticated attacks and organizational legitimacy, like their organizations are being recognized on a world scale and being respected in some ways, for the terror that they can invoke on a world scale. these are the types of things that we want to sort of strike at and sort of countering those. I know there have been some French campaigns against terror that have tried to depict that, if you are lured away and you do end up in one of these networks, you'll die a cold and lonely death somewhere remote where you're alone and you have no family around you, sort of thing. Very stark sort of messaging. And it's not just, countering. We're using techniques that we've seen other movements use, from health movements, right? Anti-smoking campaigns, that show physical degradation, physical disintegration, and then eventual death, inevitable death even. Or the real beauty movement within the feminist movement, showing how women's bodies, especially their faces, are produced and manipulated, and then deconstructing that and showing how, behind all the digital manipulation, there's a very different reality, right? And that's what these counter narratives try to do, right? One of the things, though, that I think would contribute to the success of counter narratives is if there's like a more unified voice. In this area, we talk a lot about how effective are partnerships between social media companies and government organizations and non-government organizations. But the problem is, there are organizations like this, like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism has an operating board made up of members of companies like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and has an independent advisory committee with representatives from civil society, government, intergovernmental organizations. And a lot of experts look at the work that this organization does and says, it's really moving in the right direction, but companies need to uphold international laws on things like terrorist funding, the exploitation of children, right? In the same way that we see social medias act when it comes to things such as the sexual exploitation of children, right? Another counter-narrative approach would be, for instance, infiltrating and infecting and studying these terrorist organizations, having counterterrorism agents infiltrate to get the information we need to shut down things that are essential to their recruiting, like their financial operations, right? So we can disrupt their financial transactions, or getting someone to infiltrate in order to infect, where, you get a counter agent to spread counter narratives that actually, sort of break down the psychology that is used to control followers, right? And we can't ignore the role that cultural communities can play in this, right? I said at the very beginning of my talk, I gave the caveat of we can't locate all of terrorism within Middle East and North Africa, right? So we similarly also shouldn't indict any cultural group of people for being the main source of terrorism. Otherwise, we run the risk of, really being short-sighted on this. But a lot of counter-narrative writing talks about, engaging peaceful, pro-social cultural communities. For instance, around the world, we have an abundance of, peaceful and pro-social Muslim communities, and they should be engaged. Individuals in those communities can help with perhaps help and want to help with the counter-narrative work, and they can help inform this work and make sure that it's successful, or help to ensure that it's successful. And this falls in line with the recommendations of experts that talk about, when you do this work, choosing reputable figures who have cultural knowledge and cultural expertise, and to be able to do it. And, at the same time, I would say, this should be this counter-narrative approach should be one of several techniques, right? We would never put all of our eggs in one basket, because the idea is that we should use a multifaceted approach, and that this is just one tool in a multifaceted tool repertoire that we continually revisit, that we update as we see changes in the world and on the ground. You can't ignore hybrid approaches. And I just came back from a conference, and as a professor, when you go to conference, you'll go to vendors' tables where you see different products marketed to educators. And so I would leave my contact information, and their approach is, next they email you, next they start phone calling you, and next in a representation, a rep for the company shows up at your school when you ignore the emails and the phone calls, right? And we can't help but think that terror organizations work the same way. We can't just think of them only online. They may be using hybrid approaches where there's an online contact, but then a network on the ground might be brought in to seal the contact or seal the connection, So we have to think in hybrid ways, because we know terror and violence organizations are thinking this way.
Coming back to social media technology, what about the algorithms? There are some sort of articles, and some people are talking that radicals, extremists, and terrorists, they might even manipulate those algorithms to attract the vulnerable populations, like young people, people who are, clicking on some banners and they go to whatever links. So how does it work in the practice?
Hmm. It's a great question to think about. I love that question about the manipulation. And the first thing I actually think about before I think about manipulation, I think about exploiting. In the sense that I think violence and terror organizations are exploiting in some ways features that already exist. There's an argument out there, and it's a controversial argument. Some people believe it, some people don't, that there is what's called algorithmic radicalization. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's this idea that social media platforms, by their algorithms, some of them are already set up to drive us to more and more intense, or you might even say extreme content over time, right? Some people say this is a very real thing, and we see, this is a step, this is an aid to the process of radicalization for some people. And other people say, we're grasping at straws with this. But the idea is, people have talked about this in relation to, like, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's talked about, how reported on how YouTube and other platforms have used introducing more and more extreme content over time. For instance, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has reported on how this phenomenon has potentially played out in the promotion of what's called the manosphere. The manosphere is this idea that online there's a fervent growth of anti-feminist and misogynistic groups, right? And these groups overlap with white supremacy, and that on certain social media platforms, you might be seeing users who might have, right of center views, more conservative views, especially young male consumers being driven in a more extreme direction towards manosphere type groups. Like, for instance, one offshoot of the manosphere phenomenon is something called incel culture. This idea that men, this extreme idea, this very extreme idea that men are some ways at the mercy of women, and this incel culture is actually used to fuel a very misogynistic, very violent sort of culture of regarding women as objects to be sort of treated violently or sort of even enslaved. I don't think it'd be extreme to say that. And there was actually a young man in Plymouth, England. He was only 22 years old, and he shot 6 people, including himself, after being convinced at 22 by this incel rhetoric that he was too old to find love and he was at the mercy of female overlords in some way. Very extreme, very disordered thinking, yes. But attacks like this have taken place in Canada, the US, Europe, So I guess there is an argument out there that algorithms might be inadvertently helping extremism. So extremism might be exploiting this argument. I think this, the critique of this as being a controversial idea, and there may be something there. I think there is a need for more data in this area. In other sense, it's possible to speak about exploitation of loopholes, right? For instance, making content that can fly below the radar, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of human creativity. Matthias and Kingdon, 2 researchers, talked about how human creativity is a factor at play here, how terror organizations and violence organizations are adapting content, right? So, for instance, the Christchurch mosque attacks that I talked about earlier, it's been really impossible to remove this because people keep taking pieces of this horrific content and embedding it in different ways so that it can evade algorithms and slide through traditional detection methods, right? Human creativity will always find a way to make something work, they argue, right? The Global Network on Extremism Technology talks about things like, how even when we have humans in the loop, which is something Matthias and Kingdon recommend, having human beings in addition to technological monitors, that, there's a lot of stress that human monitors face. They go through something called vicarious trauma, whereby seeing, whether it's seeing the exploitation of children sexually or violent terrorist acts, they're being subjected to a lot of vicious, violent content, and it can cause them to become traumatized in ways and experience stress and mental health injuries, that we have to be aware of. At the same time, when we're talking about algorithms, which is the technological side of the component, we have to be aware that, algorithmic systems are set up to sort of work in some ways like the human mind. I'm very grossly simplifying it when I say that, but I guess what the point I'm trying to make is that some of these algorithmic systems can sort of represent aspects of racism, classism, sexism. Researchers have been looking at how the isms have been finding their way into algorithms, unfortunately. So, if we're looking at developing better AI and more bias-resistant AI, we should be looking at, diversifying, culturally diversifying the workforce that contributes to AI technology.
Gordon, you mentioned AI, and I think it's time to go for the second section, which is about detection and monitoring. And let's continue with the AI. Many people, they ask, how is it possible that big corporations like Facebook, Google, they all employ AI, but this AI has some limitations to detect terrorist, radical, or extremist content online? Why is it like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a researcher named McDonald, who works for the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, talked about several of the techniques that are able to potentially evade AI. Something like something as simple as, and I love playing with images. I love sort of creating pastiche photos, bringing different images together. I love playing with that technology. But violence and terror organizations are adept at using it, so they'll obscure images. They may use very low-tech things like cropping or filtering pictures to sort of obscure what's being pictured, such as a terror flag or an image of a violent attack, right? In some cases, it could be as simple as using the writing function within editing software that's very basic to just squiggle or doodle across that make content difficult or more difficult for algorithms to note or pick up. In some cases, it's using watermarks or laying images over terrorist content, so it's partially obscured or it's visually, it's not as easily detected by AI. In other ways, people are being very stealth. Sometimes it's a person will make reference to, for instance, a controversial, and I'm going to keep it generic here, controversial terror leader, whether that be religious, secular, whatever, and they'll take some quotes from that person's work. Maybe not ones that, are directly attributable to espousing hate or violence or acts of terror. So in a way, they're publicizing or promoting this person in a sort of a liminal way, so that it introduces people to the thoughts or the ideologies of this person without hitting hard with terror right off the bat. Other ways we see, sometimes we see symbols that would be mundane or generic in other ways. For instance, something like a pointed upwards right finger, being used by some terror groups to signal, a certain affiliation with God or a certain religious belief, right? So it just looks like a right hand pointed upwards to the sky, a pretty simple emoticon, but really it could become embedded with terrorist meaning, take on terrorist meaning. It's a floating signifier. Network tagging, extremists feed off of each other. So you see, different terror groups with different orientations sort of supporting each other and tagging each other's content. So as you remove one, you may not be aware of another network that's also publicizing that work. And when we say it's a grassroots effort, we can't deny the fact that a lot of this is happening at the individual level, right? Facebook has been increasingly finding people with 500 friend connections, right? That was at least recently the maximum allowable by Facebook. But what they were finding with pro-ISIS accounts was that individual users were maxing out at 5,000 friends because they're actually using individual accounts to serve as these swarm these swarm spreaders of extremist ideology and other things like outlinking. Outlinking, everyone's seen something that's outlinked, I think. My students, when they go look for an inexpensive textbook to use for a class or a reading book to use for a class, they sometimes start on legitimate sites, but get linked to, piracy websites where books are being illegally sold or pirated without giving profit to the company or to the authors, right? And we would always have discussions in class about just be wary of where you're ending up. The same thing works with violence and extremist organizations. You might not start with an ISIS publication like the Al Naba newspaper on a mainstream platform, but you end up going through a series of links and ending up someplace like that. We've all had the experience of being on the internet and starting in one place and going through a series of what we could call rabbit holes or outlinks and ending up somewhere very different and wondering, how did I actually get here? Right? It's no different. Violence and terror organizations use this as well. Another technique is using, modifying the spelling, playing with language, playing with whether a message is written all in one language, whether the syntax is off, the punctuation's off, the grammar's off, using emojis to stand in for words, whereas a message, that was written all in words and espoused something hateful might be targeted by an algorithm. A message that's more broken up because their syntax is off and emojis are inserted in different languages and the letters are mixed around could evade an algorithm or an AI monitoring system, potentially.
There's one fancy term, cross-jurisdictional collaboration. And it's quite important because when you have Facebook has different rules in the United States, in some European Union countries, in Africa, in Asia, but it's one company. And when I was lecturing about counterterrorism, I showed some, let's say, e-magazines or newsletters, being on Facebook. And when students ask me why they are still there, why they can't just take them down, I said, because there are different jurisdictions. It's not that easy to do it. So how is this topic at the moment? Maybe you can tell us about some trends in this area, how it's evolving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my entry point into this discussion is through my studying of how terrorist groups use social media to fundraise. So I've looked a lot at policy in that area, if that's okay for me to speak about. There've been lots of collaborations between governments across the world, plus private organizations, plus civil organizations, where they're looking at ways that we can work across large areas that encompass many different countries, many different jurisdictions, and have effective impact. And it's been difficult. It's really been difficult. Like I look at policies like the Financial Action Task Force that was created by the G7 in 1989, way far removed from where we are right now. And it's actually grown into a policy partnership between Facebook, what was known as Twitter, but now is called X, and under 200 different countries. And it sounds like a great partnership, right? So 190, 200 countries, the major players in the social media world, but at the same time, its effectiveness hinges on things like how willing is the industry, how able is the industry to police this content, right? And how willing, our local governments and local policing, able and equipped and funded and trained and able to sort of tackle the prosecution of individuals who violate local laws, right? I've also looked at things like the terrorist finance tracking program. It was originally conceived by the US right after 9/11, but it was expanded to partner with the European Union and give it more of a global reach, right? But as the technology evolves, as this organization is trying to track terrorist funding, new loopholes emerge, right? New techniques and new methods of evasion emerge. And there are loopholes in laws that allow some terror organizations to sort of slip around. I looked at organizations like the Strengthening Internal Security and the Fight Against Terrorism group, sometimes referred to as SILT in France. It came about, I think it was first introduced for debate in 2015, but then was passed in 2017. And it's been a very controversial law, right? It's some people liken it to the Patriot Act in some way, and that allows for monitoring of digital and wireless communications. But it's also been linked to human abuse violations, right? And critics point to the fact that since the SILT law came into effect, there have been 25 or more small terror attacks across France from 2017 on. Because critics talk about how we're in a post-organization world of terror, right? There's no longer, a centralized organization with a clear figurehead. It's decentralized. It's a sort of a form of net war where you have individuals linked together through a network, but no clear leader. It's a leaderless war in some ways. Security Council of the UN, they've been issuing resolutions 2001 onwards, with, the challenge is always enforcing, the resolutions. And the Taormina statement by the G7 in 2017 looks at things like terrorist content, but also terrorist funding, but it doesn't look at the two together, right? And we have to acknowledge that there's a great degree of technological inexpertise and cultural lag. So the technology is changing and developing before, we can keep up with it. Our policing systems and our legislative systems were set up for an analog world, really. We're trying to keep up, but we don't have the expertise or the knowledge or the resources always at hand to be able to keep up in that way, unfortunately.
Gordon, there is one question from my students, and it's about when you register for social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those, you use either email or you use a phone number. And the question is why there is a method that the corporation can verify that you exist as a person in the world. Instead, you can basically register like 60 names, 60 fake emails. You can buy a phone number without registration, pay as you go. So there is no requirement to put ID card or passport number. So what do you think about this issue and what do you think is going to be the future? Will this be stricter in the future or will it remain as it is at the moment?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I think that could be the basis for our book, honestly.
You can write it. I'm more than happy.
Okay. That's a great question. One of the things that popped in mind when you're asking the question is some work I have done in looking at how social media has been used to topple regimes, like in the case of the Arab Spring, or in the case of the ongoing conflict in Syria, right, where government channels or the government controls all the channels that are available to people. So, not that this is the reason why it's been possible, but there is an argument to be made that there is a pro-social use to allowing anonymity, right? There was a famous blog that I write about called A Gay Girl in Damascus that came out, from the conflict in Syria, where it was a woman who was claiming to be an out lesbian blogger in Damascus, Syria, who was, sort of fighting against the government regime, right? And Western newspapers were really quick to follow these blog posts because, in many ways they were restricted in ways that they could get in and actually find the real story on the ground. So this blog became wildly popular after a while, right? And even as the blog started to fall apart and it was clear that it was a hoax, people were still defending it because they were saying, well, you have to expect that not all the identity details of this person will be, able to be verified because, it would be dangerous for them personally, right? In that case, it was a hoax. It was a terrible hoax that actually probably could also have endangered the lives of journalists and bloggers working in Syria and actually may have led to the deaths, we don't know, of some of these journalists and bloggers. But at the same time, there is a valid argument to be made, despite hoaxes like this, that, folks who are fighting for their rights, fighting for basic human rights, fighting for regime change, fighting against dictatorial, violent, extremist regimes, may have to be afforded some ability to be anonymous online. I think another part of this that I thought about as you were asking the question is, the question in some ways might assume that terror organizations are pro-social like we are. We follow the rules, we renew our passports when it's time, we protect our personal information. We would never think of using anyone else's personal information. I'd never think of walking across the hallway and taking my colleague's purse off her desk and going through and getting her information and then registering for something online using that. Terrorist organizations, though, I've already talked about botnets and how they can spread viruses to control computers and get them to do their bidding. In the same way, we can't expect that terror organizations are not using the techniques of fraud, right? Stealing identity. So even if requirements did come into place, there is a strong market for identity information online. Could we see an explosion in that more so than what we're seeing now, which is already intense? I think for every action, it's like a chess game on a global scale. For every action, terrorist and extremist organizations are always plotting several steps ahead.
I can confirm that because when I was in communication with the Interpol, there were reports about an opportunity to buy identity for like $15. Credit card number, address, name, phone number, and everything fits. It basically goes through the system, and $15. So imagine, Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization in Africa, they have like $10 million a month and an income. So $15 to pay for identity, it's basically nothing, So that's quite interesting. Let's go to the third section, which is about communication and founding. If I ask you and many Americans, do you have Telegram, WhatsApp, Instagram, all those applications in your phone? Maybe 99% will say, yes, I have one of them or two of them. And the question is how that encrypted element of those applications that we can communicate and nobody can listen us or nobody can see what we write in influence the radicalization, extremism, and terrorism movement. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because when you mentioned those three encrypted platforms, right, Telegram, WhatsApp, and Instagram, if you were to think about Americans, I'm from Canada originally, but North Americans, Canadians, Americans, which one they would have most likely on their phone. If I picked 5 people at random and looked at their phones, 5 young people from my class, and show me your phone and show me what apps you have, I guarantee you all 5 would likely have Instagram. And, and then after that, several would, 2, 3 would have WhatsApp. It's a great way to communicate, especially where I am. I'm actually in Brooklyn, teaching in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm at a community college in Brooklyn where it's very ethnically diverse, very culturally diverse. Our students come from all over the world, speak over 100 languages. It's a high immigrant population. So WhatsApp is a really effective way to communicate in for no money across the world, right? I've used WhatsApp, when traveling through Europe and traveling through the world. It's really effective. It's cost effective. Telegram, though, if I mention Telegram, I get blank stares. I think. It's a massive phenomenon, but it hasn't necessarily come to North America. Not that I have noticed. I challenge others to sort of show me evidence that it has, but it really has changed the landscape. I know there were numbers coming out during the pandemic that were saying that people were signing up, like at the beginning of 2021, like 100 million new accounts for, or almost, in those areas for new accounts for Telegram. Signal is also another one that I have not heard any mention of in North America. Signal was also, galloping ahead during the pandemic. It's interesting, the encryption that they use to protect the privacy of users and their communication have also been used in pro-social ways. And I keep returning to pro-social because I also looked at protest movements around the world. And pro-social protesters who are seeking real positive change, are using these encrypted technologies to conceal their identities, in places like, where they're fighting repressive governments or repressive regimes in Belarus, Hong Kong, Japan, not Japan, sorry, Iran. But at the same time, we see that terror organizations were some of the first to exploit these encrypted technologies. Like, foreign policy talks about how, I think it was Al Qaeda and the Islamic State organizations, ISIS, were some of the first users of Telegram, when it first came out, to sort of seize upon it. These platforms, in addition to shielding violence and extremist organizations, also shield child predators, right? It's Telegram, I know, has been banned in Russia, I'm pretty sure, because they wanted they appealed to the founder and said, can we have access? Give us access, and he refused to do it. But Telegram has actually, to their credit, actually agreed to participate with terror probes in different countries, right? So, like, laws have not kept pace with this encrypted technology. There's police officers. There's an international organization or International Association of Police Officers or Chiefs of Police, and they talk about how with encrypted technology, a lot of crime research stops. It just goes dark, right? Because vital evidence can't be gained. Crime scenes from terrorist attacks, homicides, kidnapping, violent actions, right? Leave digital footprints. But when encrypted technology is used, getting the fingerprints, which in the digital age are the files, the content, it's becoming increasingly difficult with these encrypted technologies. It's really hard to get court orders to sort of get the information that you need. I think social media platforms are increasingly asking for law organizations to go through rigorous sort of steps to get lawful court orders, to get the evidence that they need. I think they're thinking in terms of the protection of their users and also making sure that there's no exploitation of privacy or the individual user. People have talked about, if we, just ban encrypted technologies, it could have an adverse effect and drive terror and extremist groups further underground, at least with, encrypted technology platforms being somewhat willing to work with law enforcement, that there is a chance that there's a backdoor, there's a chute whereby, through legal procedures, terror organizations can be discovered in encrypted technologies. But critics also point to the fact that there's a slippery slope here. How about the fact that they point to things such as the Patriot Act after 9/11, how the Patriot Act actually allowed the FBI to evade getting a judge to sign off on orders that would allow them access to computer records, phone records, credit histories, things like that, and how in like a 3-year span, there's an analysis by the ACLU that shows in a 3-year span from 2023 to 2026 that the FBI issued something like 190,000 plus of these orders where they're wanting access. Right, so 190,000 in 3 years, where you're basically delving into people's private information, their phone records, over 3 years. But then the ACLU points to the fact that they can only find one prosecution that results from that 190,000 cases in which people's privacy was violated, right? So is it really something that is necessary? Is it being used responsibly? So the ACLU, also noted how, with the case of the Patriot Act, they actually had, as part of the Patriot Act, a bit of a gag order there. So that if you did get one of these letters from the FBI saying, we're going to delve into all your private information, you then couldn't talk about it. You were imposed with a gag order, which actually was, several legal rulings, several courts have found these unconstitutional to try to gag someone in this way. And I think that's the worry about things like Francis law, right? That human rights abuses will result when we start digging into things like encrypted technology. There could be a slippery slope, like there were with, some people argue with laws like SILT and the Patriot Act, right? So yeah, go ahead.
One element I would like to add to your talk is the role of AI, because there are articles and tutorials how you can even create your own application for communication. So you and me, we can create our application based on some sort of offshore servers, so it's much more difficult for the US or European Union or UK to get access to. And then, that magic story starts, who is responsible for what and who can do what, because there are many countries, we can say failed states, where the order works according to how much you pay. Yeah, those structures are very fragile. They are managed by different people. So I think this is also a significant factor to add, that unfortunately, you can use AI for good things and also for the bad things. And one of those bad things is this element of communication among radicals, terrorists, and extremists. So that's
we tend to talk about AI as being a tool in the fighting of violence and extremism. But anything that can be used to fight violence and extremism can be used to construct it and propagate it, right? So we think of AI now with many of the assessments of AI are maybe short-sighted right now because we don't fully grasp it. We're caught up in that cultural lag, and we haven't really kept pace with the technology. But you have to believe that if AI is being used to target and stop and counter violence and extremism, it's also being used to propagate it and recruit and develop scripts and develop content that can also further its goals, its antisocial goals.
Gordon, what's your opinion about financing and social media? Because I have two examples. The first example comes from, I think, 2 years ago when I was lecturing terrorism, and I found a picture. There was a girl or boy, I don't remember, and it was from that poor environment with that typical background of the house, which is like almost collapsed. And they ask for money for financing, help to this family because of this and that. The second example is using deep fake technology that someone famous in the community said or supported an idea that this is a good thing to finance, to help, and people donated. They donated like $3, $5. Some of them donated maybe $100, which is nothing that it's not a significant portion of your income. But if you have like 600 people donating for $2, then you can buy some significant tools to spread terrorism, radicalization, and extremism. So what's your opinion about social media and fundraising for those purposes?
Yeah, thinking about the crowdsourcing concept that you introduced, the idea that there is this idea of fundraising on a small scale, right? We might find legal organizations looking for large transactions, right? But we're increasingly seeing how the cost of terror attacks is going down. So if you had someone crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, getting small numbers, even $1, $2, $3 from 600, 1,000 people, that could be enough to fund some really significant terror attacks. For instance, we think about terror attacks requiring, huge organizations and lots of money, but increasingly, if you look at 76% of terror plots from 1994 to 2013, most of them were relatively inexpensive from a Western standard, costing under 10,000 American, right? And recently, if you look more recently at, for instance, the Boston Marathon bombings, those were estimated to cost only about $500 US by scholars like Shanahan. So that's a really small amount, and using materials that are not hard to source. I believe they were pressure cookers, plus also damaging sort of content materials put in those. But the impact of these, it really illustrates the power of these organizations to capitalize on small actions, right? It's a small cost, small bombs, that wreak, untold human suffering, and the psychological trauma that they create. The impact of that lasts for generations, right? For very small actions. The immediacy and the hyper-personal nature of social media makes us susceptible sometimes to appeals when we normally wouldn't. Terror groups have used humanitarian charity appeals, right? When you were talking about the falling down house, I'm thinking about the humanitarian charity appeals, like where it's being argued to be used to help women and children, but it's really being funneled to fund fighters, right? It's capitalizing too, a wonderful pro-social, socially upright Muslim family who would never give to terror might come across an appeal on their computer screens that says, we need your money, we need your help to sort of help this orphanage in this far-flung part of the world where they lack basic resources. And Islam actually directs its followers, its good pro-social followers, give to charity, give of yourself. It's a religion that preaches, giving and contribution to others and helping others. Family, might be saying, well, we have to give. This is a group of orphans and they need our help, right? But the money then gets inadvertently funded somewhere else, right? Or, someone might find themselves questioning their beliefs if they see one of these deep fakes, right? Because, often with celebrities online, we have these hyper-personal attractions to them. Like we feel like we know them. We talk about them as though we know their life story, as though they told it to us personally. We know their accomplishments. We know who they are. So when you see a deep fake with someone promoting an organization, people might start to question, their own belief systems. Where they see, I'm so hyper-connected to this person. Should I be questioning my support for this or my non-support for this idea? It's an interesting phenomenon. Both are interesting phenomenons. And we can't ignore the fact that there's this, I write about the Western savior complex, about how Western societies sometimes envision themselves as saviors of, folks, people in the developing world. Actually, that's not a correct term anymore. We say like rich societies versus lean societies. So the West, views itself as sort of being a savior of areas that are leaner economically, right? Of individuals from those areas that are leaner economically. And we see this played out all across popular culture. And charity appeals and scams will play upon that, the need that this complex engenders within people to rescue others or save others, which in itself, warrants more investigation.
The last question for today's interview, Gordon. There are some cases where people might see, extremist or radical banners, maybe some videos on social media. Students, adults, doesn't matter who, what to do. What would be your recommendation for the reactions? How to react when I see something on my screen, on my mobile phone? And what would you recommend, how to think, when people are surprised, people don't have time. Some of them, they said, I'm not going to bother. I just leave and I go to work and that's it. So what would be your recommendation? How to deal with those situations if someone is going to face them?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a hard question to answer. It's like, what's the public role in identifying and reporting terrorist activities? I think you see, social media platforms already have, mechanisms in place for people policing extremist content. Not just, I'm talking about terror and violence and extremism, but in the U.S. we're in a situation now where there's a deep political divide, right? It runs down the center of the country. There's a deep political division, and we're seeing that people are using the platform tools to actually report and shut down violent and extremist talk that's related to sort of extremist views of that challenge basic fundamental rights and freedoms, right? So on one hand, I think there is a function that is working where people are given the tools that allow them to police and flag things for greater examination. On the other hand, we run the risk with tools like that. There's a pro-social, there's an anti-social use. This could also be used to, silence critics, right, who have valid viewpoints, who have valid critiques, who are raising important points in society. So I think there is some function there. I think when it comes to, how could we, be more active in engaging this, I think we have to look to our societies as a way to sort of develop strategies more than just reporting and flagging. It's what do we do with the people who break away from terrorism and extremism? How do we sort of bring them back into the fold? We've seen the phenomenon here in North America where, as certain content, certain ideas get increasingly flagged, those users break off, splinter off, and form a group that's insular, and it becomes like an echo chamber, right? So we don't want to see the creation of echo chambers. We want to, as much as possible, sort of maintain an open and active discourse, amongst folks of all different ideologies, right? To a certain extent. But at the same time, what is to be made to what sort of function do we have to sort of pull folks back away when those splinters do happen? How do we reintegrate them, or even avoid them from being splintered in the first place? We don't want to shut down a conversation, but we also don't want to propagate violence and extremism at the same time. These functions get misused, unfortunately, but that shouldn't be a reason for not having them. They're good safety valve to have in place. I don't know if I really captured the question on that. I don't know if I really answered the question on that, but it's something that I think warrants more examination. I think so much of the discussion focuses on the macro level. I think users being vigilant and using the tools and just understanding what the tools mean when they use them and using them responsibly. I think it's important that individuals on the ground develop media literacy. Like, what are the tools that we're using mean? What do they mean? What are the implications of using these tools? The ideas of, some of these tools, for example, some of these tools limit the length of our messages and force us into brevity. But what's the implication of that? What's lost when we do that sort of thing? I think encouraging media and technology literacy is really important, especially when areas like North America are sorely lagging behind when it comes to STEM and technology education compared to the rest of the world. We can look at some, they talk about the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, as being leaner economically in some ways than the West, more robust in other ways, but that they really excel in technological and education, STEM education, in the way that richer economies in the West don't necessarily, well, with the exception of Germany. Germany has sort of tried to keep pace, but have not really accomplished. So becoming more technologically adept, becoming more information literate, more technology literate, I think are some ways moving forward. And plus using the tools responsibly.
Gordon, thank you very much for your time, for your insightful remarks and comments and opinions about this very difficult topic. I really appreciate that you accepted the invitation because of your, let's say, the whole picture that you have and that you're dealing with, which is, I think, very relevant for students and for research of terrorism, extremism, and radicalization. And also, I like how you express those two perspectives about privacy, about identity, about reporting, because as you said, those tools and instruments can be used both sides, for good and bad purposes. Gordon, thanks again for being on Our Thinker.